Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience, a podcast of the private, digital-first National Museum of American Religion, which explores what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. Please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you listen, and tell your colleagues, friends, and family to do the same. The country's 250th anniversary is almost here, and the National Museum of American Religion is working overtime to shed light on religion's role in the founding of the American Republic. One Christian denomination that looms large in the American founding is the Congregationalists of New England. The Congregational Library and Archives in Boston has put together an exhibit entitled Sacred Rebellion, Congregationalists in Revolutionary Massachusetts, that tells their story of their roles in the American Revolution. Today, we will talk with Dr. Kyle Roberts and Dr. Tricia Pione of the Congregational Library and Archives to better understand this story. Kyle B. Roberts was appointed as the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives in 2022. He received his BA in American Studies from Williams College and his PhD in History from the University of Pennsylvania. Tricia Pione is the Project Director of New England's Hidden Histories at the Congregational Library and Archives. She previously worked at Historic New England, where she was a research scholar for the Recovering New England's Voices Project. She holds a PhD in history from the University of New Hampshire with a specialization in the early modern Atlantic world and history of science. Kyle and Tricia, thank you both for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Can we start out by you telling us something about the history and mission of the Congregational Library and Archives for listeners who might not be familiar with your institution and your work?
Gladly. So the Congregational Library and Archives was established in 1853, and it's our mission to foster a greater understanding of the spiritual, civic, cultural, and intellectual dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. And I think that ongoing relevance part's really important for us, that as a very old institution, we could just collect 400 years worth of history in North America and focus on the past, but instead we're really kind of interested in what the lessons of the past have to tell us today in the 21st century, really in some ways to help prepare us for the future. And we do this through a research library that has about 225,000 books and manuscripts and serials and sermons. How many sermons, Tricia? So many sermons.
15,000.
1,000 sermons. Oh. And through a digital archive that has 130,000 images of from New England church records. And we support research fellowships, and we do online exhibits. And as we're talking to you today, we're doing our first in-person exhibit. And this was really been an opportunity for the library to jump into its collections, to go into our stacks and look for materials that haven't really seen the light of day much before. I mean, Tricia, you started a little after I started here, and as our curator for this exhibit, I think you really had a great opportunity to kind of create from scratch, right?
There were many treasures to be found hidden in our drawers and in our stacks. Yes.
That must have been a great project for you, Tricia. We'll get into that, but sounds like your organization is a good one, important on the American religious landscape, both to look at our past and to chart our future. So thank you for that. You were located in Boston, right where the revolution began. Can you give our listeners a brief history of the Congregational Church, bringing us right up to 1775, including what positions they occupied on the landscape of 1770s Massachusetts?
So Congregationalism emerges from the Protestant Reformation and English Puritans and Pilgrims that most people might be familiar with. The story of Plymouth Rock and the founding of Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston. By the 1620s, New England Puritans are creating these independent churches in towns throughout Massachusetts. They're centering them on congregations that are communities that believe very strongly in a right to govern themselves. They're autonomous. They choose their own ministers. They decide who can be a member of the church. And so by the time we get to sort of the run up to the American Revolution, by the time we get to the mid 18th century, there's a congregational meeting house or church in the center of basically every town in Massachusetts. It is the established church in Massachusetts, meaning that everyone pays taxes that support the salary of the minister. And so we find that as the revolution is sort of building up, as crises emerge in the 1760s and 1770s, congregational ministers are often at the center of some of these controversies. They're giving sermons about some of the big events that many people might be familiar with, like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Quebec Act. These are some of the topics that are certainly of great concern to congregational ministers and to their congregations. And because the meeting house was the center of most of these communities, it was a community space. So there's also political meetings that are happening in congregational meeting houses in this period.
Okay. Is it fair to say that Pilgrims and Puritans became Congregationalists? Is that a good statement? Accurate?
Yes.
Our listeners, and we have heard Pilgrims and Puritans, and then we also hear Congregationalists, and it's good to understand the relationship. Okay. Kyle, anything to add to what Tricia just said about bringing us up to 1775?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was, we think today, right, when we look back on American religion, when we look in this kind of small towns across New England and across the country, we think of a spiritual marketplace, right? We think of a place where you might have on the town green 3 or 4 churches of all these different denominational flavors. Before the Revolution, there were Quakers and there were Baptists in New England, but they were fairly small in number. You know, these are one church communities. And I think one of the things that's really important, and I think Tricia brings this out well in the exhibit, people had to figure out how to get along, right? You know, these were communities where everyone they recognized that there was this one church and they're paying their taxes to support their minister. And there's a real premium, I think, on the idea of consensus in these communities about how do you build agreement for everyone to be on the same page. Now, we recognize that sometimes consensus in periods of crisis can also have another edge to it, right? That consensus can also feel like coercion at times. But these are really communities where you're going to have everybody across the kind of economic class divide, as well as enslaved people worshiping alongside, free people. So these really are kind of the community in microcosm. And we felt it was important to, in this, as we're soon to talk about in the exhibit, to recenter that, to remember for folks that there's a religious, the religious center is also the political center.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing, which is very foreign to us today, but it's good that you made that point, that then that was the case. What is the story traditionally told about the role played by Congregationalists in the American Revolution? What is the story that you are looking to tell in your exhibit?
So I'm a New Englander. I grew up here. Grew up in a United Church of Christ church, which is the kind of descendant denomination from the Congregationalists. And here we told a pretty celebratory story about ministers who were largely patriots. That bears itself out that a disproportionate number of congregational ministers favored rebellion. Now, we wanted to complicate that story a little bit because we recognize that when we tell history today, we don't just focus on the elite male political or religious leader, of a community. We also want to understand all of the individuals who are worshiping within that church.
Right.
It starts to get a little more complicated. Now, for your listeners who are familiar with the history of the 18th century, this was a period of great revivalism. So there are theological differences in each of these different communities that we have to take into account. These are also much more diverse communities than I think we used to recognize. That whilst the system of enslavement here did not look the same as it did in other colonies, i.e., there's not plantation slavery here. There is, in fact, widespread slavery within individual houses. And, we increasingly see that many ministers owned enslaved people. So we're trying to move away from this very kind of simplistic notion that patriot preachers led the revolution and all of their congregants followed, to flip it, to flip the narrative a little. And, I think this accords in many ways, maybe with the way that Trish and I both think about history and the types of stories that we knew from the start we wanted to tell. I was so blessed, so Trish is the project director for New England's Hidden Histories. And this is a digital project that's been going for 20 years. And this was an opportunity to really mine that digital archive, as well as looking at the physical collections that we have. And this bottom-up approach, I think, is really in accordance with the vision that Trisha's had. Do you want to talk? Is that fair, Trisha? I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth about how you approached thinking about retelling the story.
Yeah, I think, some challenging some of the preconceived ideas we have about the revolution in New England, because there is this very strong narrative of, as you say, these patriot preachers, and we don't necessarily get the full view of how interesting the debates they had were, right? When we, if we just take at face value the story that everyone was on board and anti-British, right from the start, we miss really interesting discussions that people were having, often in church, that these are often community debates about what does liberty actually mean? And particularly ministers who start to take a look at this language of liberty and recognize, like Samuel Hopkins, who was a minister in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, before moving to Newport, Rhode Island, that he enslaved people in his household. And when he moves to Rhode Island, he comes to realize, through the experience of viewing what was one of the largest ports for enslaved people coming into New England, as part of the triangle trade in the Atlantic, and his experience also with Black parishioners in his congregation. And he starts to ask these questions about, what does liberty mean? And so through that, you get just a much more nuanced understanding of how people actually understood liberty. We tend to sometimes read about people during the period of the Revolution, white people in particular, thinking of liberty as and speaking of slavery only as a metaphor, as if they couldn't possibly understand what was actually happening. And Samuel Hopkins is such a great counterpoint to that, as he sort of wrestles with his own involvement in slavery as an enslaver, and then comes to say that actually in 1776 he writes to the Continental Congress and says slavery is our national sin. And that's in 1776, and we don't always think about the implications of that.
Right. Remind us, when was the first Great Awakening? This was early 18th century, so this had happened in New England, and so these Congregationalist-based towns had and were dealing with that. Different Baptists and others, especially, I guess, Baptists growing in prominence, but still small. Is that fair?
Yeah, so the 1730s, 1737 in Northampton is often seen as the kind of beginning of the American version of the Great Awakening. And it's a transatlantic phenomenon, I think, as many know. But the revivals, they come and go. It's not quite so neat. So there is revivalistic activity happening in the 1760s and 1770s.
Okay. Your exhibition there is full of famous and not so famous Congregationalists. Can you tell us about some of the specific individuals from the time that most intrigue and inspire you? And Tricia just mentioned one, which I think was great. What else do we need to know?
Yeah. Tricia, you want to go first?
Sure. I think one of my favorites is we have this really unique collection written by a woman named Mary Counts. And she lived in Boston throughout the Revolutionary War, and we have some letters that she wrote and some one of her diaries, notes she took about sermons she'd heard, and her diaries and her letters are just so fascinating. This is not a person that most people have ever heard of. Mary Counts is not a familiar name, even really to scholars of American women or religious history. Most people don't know about Mary Counts, and her she does things like she writes a poem after the Boston Massacre about how it has impacted her and the emotional charge of that night. She writes letters where she talks about seeing cartloads of dead bodies in Charlestown during the siege of Boston. So she stays in Boston during the siege of Boston, which takes place from after the battles of Lexington and Concord. The British occupy the city of Boston for about a year, and Mary Counts stays. And she writes about arguments she has with loyalists. She meets a young man who tells her that the Old South Meeting House, which is one of the Congregational churches in Boston, you can visit it today. It's a historic site. But the British were using it. They had taken over and were using it as stables for horses. And so she writes about having this argument with a young loyalist who says that he's glad that it's being used as a riding house for horses and that it's been a house of sedition ever since it was built. And she tells him boldly that she will hear the gospel of Christ preached there again. And so these are very emotionally charged letters that she's writing during this period, and yet she's not very well known. And it's just such a fascinating resource to get her experience of the war, but also to get a fairly unknown woman's experience of the war and to be able to read her writings. She interprets the whole siege of Boston as a personal religious experience, basically.
Really? Wow.
These are materials which anyone can now read on our digital archive, but it exists in manuscript form. None of this has ever been published. None of this has ever been used by scholars of the American Revolution. And I think it's sort of fascinating, isn't it, that 250 years later, we're still discovering material, still finding material that our forefathers and foremothers preserved. There's so many people in this exhibit, and I encourage everybody who has a chance to come and see it. Somebody who I've become intrigued with is a young kid named Timothy Dickinson. And Timothy lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, and he was about 14, 15 years old when the battles at Concord and Lexington happened. My nephews are like 19 and 21, and I wouldn't want them anywhere near Concord and Lexington, even at their slightly more advanced age. So you remember, that this was something that impacted folks at all ages. So Timothy, by his admission, was a sickly kid. He had brothers and sisters who were much stronger. He was in and out of, illness. But he thought that if he enlisted, it might toughen him up. There's sort of, for those who think about the YMCA movement, the idea of muscular Christianity, there's a little bit there that I can kind of picture him like, well, I'll grow up there. And so he enlists, and we know this because he wrote just after the Revolution, an autobiography that only exists in manuscript form with us. He first enlisted, and he was at the Battle of Ticonderoga, which was not a victory for the Americans. And you see him recording in this 3-month enlistment his escape. Then he goes home. He gets sick. He goes home to Amherst and he recovers, and then he signs back up and he goes to Saratoga. And Saratoga is a great victory, and he's there to witness it. And he has this eyewitness account of what happens on the field there. And again, much like what Tricia shares with Mary Counts, all blessings go to God, that this is a providential delivery in his view. He goes home again and he enlists one more time, and this time for 9 months. And this is, the longest campaign. So it's a nice reminder, I think, because I think we forget what military life was like then. These are folks who are signing up in militias for short periods and then coming back. He signs up for the final period for 9 months, and he says he has a very explicit goal: to save enough money to go to school. And for me, it's just like, oh, is this like the GI Bill, American Revolution version? And he does his service for those 9 months, and that's enough money for him to go to Dartmouth. and he gets his degree and is ordained as a congregational minister and serves in Holliston, Massachusetts, which is a little, town down here. And, he dies at a relatively young age. I think he's probably in his 30s when he passes. And he's there for his career. But you see in this that perhaps one of the most important and formative moments in his life, and the one that he really wanted to record in this autobiography, is that wartime experience. If listeners out there think Dickinson, Amherst sound familiar, they do, because he was Emily Dickinson's great uncle.
Okay.
And I was talking to a friend the other day who was commenting, 18th and 19th century New England were just one really big village, that all of these stories interconnect. And, for us, I think it's kind of, exciting when we're talking to folks who are not scholars of American history, but are interested in these kind of other connections. And to know that, like Emily Dickinson, a famous Congregationalist herself, had this four ancestor who had this experience. It kind of even, helps us think about the long legacy of the revolution.
Yeah. Those are two great stories. And I'll be sure to put in the show notes links to your digital archives, or maybe we can communicate. You tell me what the best thing is to put in there so that the listeners can go and see for themselves some of these, great things you have there. Were Congregationalists moved by their theology to throw off the yoke of the king, or were they moved by other reasons and used their theology to support it?
Yeah, Trish and I were talking a little bit about this back and forth. I mean, I think the answer is both. I think it's hard to disentangle those two. There are certainly theological justifications that they are pulling on as they think about what their requirements are towards state authority. It's important to remember we've mentioned the revivals already. We've mentioned the theological landscape is rich, and you have folks that are going to eventually be on the more liberal side of the theological spectrum, and it will eventually become Unitarian after the revolution. They're going to see things slightly differently, and they're going to understand the relationship between church and state in a slightly different way than those who are more on the reform side. They are all reading John Calvin and John Locke. They have models from those thinkers about what the correct relationship is and what one's rights and responsibilities are when they see threats to religious liberty. The very first object in the exhibit is a 1750 sermon by Jonathan Mayhew. And Mayhew was a minister at one of the many Congregational churches here in Boston. Fascinatingly, he's also the son of Experience Mayhew, who is the missionary to the Wampanoag in Martha's Vineyard. So he's a missionary's kid, but he goes to Harvard. And I think I think he really likes the intellectual world of Boston and Cambridge. I don't think he was hankering to get back to Martha's Vineyard, which would have been a very remote place. He preaches in 1750 a sermon which is basically on the limits of submission and the rights of resistance when religious liberty is threatened. He preaches this in 1750, long before there's any England American Revolution. He preaches it on the 100th anniversary of the execution of Charles I. And he's basically, as far as we know, the first minister in New England to even touch that topic. That's seen as an excess of the English Civil War. It's a very loaded example. But he perceives the threats to religious liberty. We remember, right, that Congregationalists were the established church in Massachusetts, but certainly not the established church of the British Empire. Right, that is going to be held by the Church of England, and there's always a tension, and there's always a fear that the revocation of the Massachusetts Charter, or the machinations, their words not mine, of the Anglican bishops would be moving, trying to recenter the Church of England. And so I think what we see in there is that theology provides a very rich, their theology provides a very rich wellspring from which to understand threats that, in fact, for them, were both spiritual and political.
Right.
The things we want to add to that, Tricia, I mean, I think I always go to him because I think he's such a great example. And the other part of that story I would add is Mayhew is remembered by the revolutionary generation. John Adams writes to Thomas Jefferson in 1818 and sends him a copy of this sermon by Mayhew and says, "This was my catechism when I was a 14-year-old boy at Harvard." This sermon basically got Adams thinking about what the relationship is between religion and the state and what the steps you're entitled to take when that's threatened.
Wow.
Kind of blows my mind a little.
Yeah. No, I agree. Trish, anything to add?
I'm often, because was primarily a scholar of the 17th century, I'm still often shocked sometimes too by Mayhew's pretty bold choice. It's 100 years since the execution of King Charles I when he's writing. And, it's for the relationship between England and New England, still a sensitive topic that he would still defend regicides and defend New England's past in the 17th century when, it was a controversial outpost of the early British Empire and in the Atlantic world. And that, he would choose that as the example to speak on. And also what I think too is fascinating about that is that so many people would still have that in their memory. This is generations ago, and yet it's still the English Civil Wars and the impact on New England and Puritans in New England, that it would still be such a fresh memory for them, that it's really part of their public memory for them is the execution of the king and a defense of it.
Yeah, I've never heard that story. I don't think I've heard that name. I may have heard that name in my readings of John Adams, but this is fascinating stuff. Thank you for sharing that. Were most Congregationalists patriots or loyalists in 1775? Can I even ask that question? Do we know?
We can guess. We can make an educated guess, and primarily, certainly by and large, most Congregationalists were on the side of the patriots. But there are certainly significant examples of Congregationalists who were not, including congregational ministers. That's another really interesting part of this exhibition is we do tend to think about patriot preachers, but there were quite a few who were either suspected of being loyalists by their congregation or just outright, like Reverend Mather Byles in Boston, who was praying for the king and put under house arrest. So there are some really interesting examples of Congregationalists who wrestled with the question and were certainly loyalists.
I think I would add to that we used to say back in the day that 1/3 were patriot, 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 were kind of wanted to be neutral or somewhere in the middle. I think what we say today is maybe 1/5 to 1/10 were full patriot and 1/5 to 1/10 were loyalists, and that it was so much about contingency. It was about that if the war, if you were in occupied Boston, you didn't really have a choice, right? You had to figure out where you fell. If you're in the countryside, if you're in the hinterland where there's less pressure on, there's just a lot of ambivalence. And I mean ambivalence not in the not caring, but in the understanding both sides and really being torn in both ways. What we try to remind folks of in this exhibit is it was a long war, right? This was a much longer war than I think either side thought it would be. And so as it drags on and as victory is not clear, and as it often looks like the British are actually doing a lot better than the Continental Army, sustaining community, sustaining faith. One of the great documents that Tricia found, one of the first accusations that a community makes against the minister that they think is a loyalist or that they feel is too loyalist is that he's not doing enough to encourage enlistment for the army. But I think we can all think about if we were in a community and it was the 4th or 5th year that this war has dragged on and we're not seeing gains, do we really want to put full effort? Do we want to keep sending our sons off into these battles? So I think there are these ways that we really have to remember that there are always going to be people who are fervent, but that the majority of us really are trying to take the information that we have and understand. And of course, we can't talk about any of this, right? Maybe the biggest difference between us today and us and our ancestors in the 18th century is the role of providence in all of this, right? I think most of us do not start from a framework. Most of our visitors don't start from a framework where they see God playing an active role in their lives every single day. We really have to readjust to understand the 18th century. Tricia, what's that sermon that you have in the legacy section that is about, the frown of heaven?
Nathan Fisk gives a sermon. I think it's to commemorate the victory at Yorktown. And he says something like that this defeat will be remembered across time as the frown of heaven upon the British. That this is, because of this defeat, the significant defeat at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, that's God's displeasure with the British for the way the British have treated the American colonists. And that's what history will record, that God favored the American side and was frowning at the British.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if you're in one of these towns that has, half of the young men off and enlisted. Is God frowning on you at that point? Is he frowning on your community? So I think everything today, of course, is complicated, but I think that identity that folks are embracing about being a loyalist or being a patriot is probably a result of many different calculations.
Yeah. Yep. Fair enough. Okay. Before we move on, you've touched on a few sermons, but do you want to share any other examples from sermons or lay members' letters besides the ones you've shared with us already that you really want to get out there?
There's some really beautiful, just thinking about the materiality of some of these sermons and what survived. And we have a beautiful collection of about 300 manuscript sermons from the period of the American Revolution. So out of our collection of, more than 15,000 print and manuscript sermons, about 300 manuscript sermons are from this period. And, when you look at them and you think about this survived, this manuscript sermon written in 1775 survived. And some of them are by ministers who didn't publish any sermons. They never published any. And yet we've got these records of sermons that they did preach. And many of them are from more rural areas of New England. So they're not the sermons that most scholars are usually going to see. And we've digitized a bunch of them recently, which is really exciting. And they're available online. And there's a sermon by a minister from Wrentham, Massachusetts, Joseph Bean, and he gives a sermon on the repeal of the Stamp Act, as many other ministers did in 1766 to celebrate that as a victory. And he compares the repeal of the Stamp Act to the story of Abraham's sacrifice of his son. And that's maybe a bit dramatic, but he says, that was he calls that a very melancholy story. But he uses that to explain the fact that the Stamp Act has been repealed. And he says that it is the interposition of divine providence in our favor in the late removal of our burdens and fears and the repeal of the Stamp Act, which has been so grievous to these American colonies. And then he writes in part of a hymn from Watts, an Isaac Watts hymn 129, which is also about Abraham and his son. And he writes it, and that's the hymn that he wants to use in this sermon that he gives in 1766. It's just really beautiful.
Wow. That is amazing. We'll definitely have to get, and this people can see digitally.
Yes.
Okay. We'll have to call that one out. Kyle, anything from you? A sermon or a letter, anything you want to share?
I mean, it's so hard to choose. I think what I would want to just raise up is the work that Tricia and we had a grant from the American Theological Library Association last summer to really, try to repopulate the sources we use. Because if you only rely on the printed sermons from that period, you're missing so much of the day-to-day life. We have to remember that many sermons were printed, but they were often printed either at the impetus of the minister, but more often of the congregation, and therefore extraordinary circumstances. Something major has happened, and you publish a sermon about it. I think, I love the sermons where it's in the midst of wartime, but they're not talking about the war, right? These
Right.
where you'd assume that would be all that people are talking about. But, I think we can think about our own lifetimes and the inability to sustain a constant discourse and the need to be able to think about other things, other facets of our lives. And you get those in these manuscript sermons that were often the notes, right, that the ministers were writing, either, as they're getting ready to preach. Maybe the final thing I would say is there's a couple of these sermons that record each of the times that the minister preached them. And you would kind of think that like a sermon published, in 1776, that has patriotic themes in it might not have legs in 1789, in 1802, and 1810. But we see that they're re-preaching these at different times. And I think that just opens up a wonderful set of questions to research or to speculate on. What is the long life of these sermons? And how do they keep having meaning? The cynic listening could be like, well, they're just lazy. They already wrote it, so they might as well use it again. But I think there's probably a little intentionality there too.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, moving on. So violence and destruction affected many Massachusetts communities during the Revolutionary War, obviously. How did their faith help sustain Congregationalists during this trying time?
It's a great question, and it's one that we don't know a lot about. I think there's a lot of research opportunities for understanding the wartime experience. What we do know, and we've already started to talk about this, is that tempers flared, patience was frayed. There's a fantastic letter in the exhibit that Tricia found. It's the only piece that we have from the Congregational Church in Lancaster, Massachusetts. And it's 3 congregants writing a letter of complaint to their sisters and brethren in the congregation about the minister. And I've referenced it already, it's the complaint about him not doing enough to really build up enlistments and to promote that. It then goes on and it accuses him of being overly friendly to the Catholics, which is sadly one of the original cardinal sins of Congregationalism. It's fervent anti-Catholicism in the 17th and 18th century. But I think it really does speak to how ministers were probably doing their best to keep these congregations going, and that people were displacing their frustrations sometimes on those ministers. We also know that sometimes churches were disbanded, that sometimes they were unable to. Tricia, you gave the great example of Old South Meeting House. There is a wonderful volume in our collection from one of the Connecticut associations. An association is a group of ministers in a region that gets together and meets. It's kind of a support group for them. You flip through this, and there are full records up until 1767. And then there are 3 or 4 pages that are completely blank. And then it starts right again in 1783. And you have to wonder, did they not meet? Did they meet but not write the notes in the volume for fear that if it fell into the wrong hands?
Right.
It raises lots of questions about these things that we're trying to figure out, about how do you sustain yourself in these times. Now, other associations did meet, and we have full records, there in the exhibit as well. But was there something that was happening in that community in particular that made it difficult? And I think it's always a good reminder that, this was a serious war, right? That there were repercussions, including charges of treason, and that people did have to be on their guard about the things that they were doing. But I think we do see a real through line that is faith, that they continue, and their faith doesn't waver. Their belief in providence doesn't appear to waver. If anything, they've been trained by the Puritan generation in some ways to blame themselves if that God has displeasure with them and their community for the things that they haven't done. I think we get a different sensibility a century or two later.
Definitely. This leads into the next question. What were some of the motivations held by Congregationalists in fighting the war? I mean, you mentioned some of this Calvinistic Puritan theology. Tell us more about that.
I think it is partly this this idea of providence and a certainty almost, which is a little heretical to them, but also they seemed actually quite confident that God was on their side. There's a Massachusetts Convention of Congregational Ministers that meet about a month after Lexington and Concord, and they vote on what actions they should take as the body of ministers for the province of Massachusetts Bay. And they what they decide to do is to supply the newly raised army with chaplains. So, they are facing the situation of war breaking out and deciding that the need that they can meet is to provide religious support for the war and for the army. And they invoke the guidance and protection of providence in fighting the war. So certainly they're interpreting it through that religious lens. But some of the letters and diaries we have are also showing that people are being motivated also equally by economic motives. Timothy Dickinson, as Kyle mentioned, is certainly part of it is he wants his pay, he wants his army pay. So I think it's the motivations are complex for everyone. And I don't know, Kyle, do you want to add more to that?
I think the one thing which is the congregational part of this, the basis of Congregationalism is this feeling of an unfinished Reformation, right? That the purest form of community is the covenanted group of people who agree, as Tricia said at the beginning of this podcast, to agree to be in community. They are self-governing. They are autonomous. They choose their minister from amongst their ranks. He's not installed from someplace else. They are fervently anti-hierarchical. This has a downside that it's often hard for them to get to agree altogether, to have a bunch of churches to do something. And this revolution is at its core about governance, right? It is at its core about who gets to rule. And I think that they couldn't not see their own situatedness, their own, for many of them, up to 200 years of learning how to be in community with each other and not see a problem. So I think we have to think in many ways that there's something almost personal, I guess, for Congregationalists in this, that they can connect the dots between something that feels like the removal of liberties that they previously had and that they previously enjoyed, and the real importance of having to push back against that.
Okay. We're going to get to liberty in a second, but I want to go back. Tricia, you said something about this group of congregational ministers saying something that was somewhat heretical. What did you mean?
Oh, just that they they didn't say something heretical. I just meant that they, their certainty that God was on their side. Puritan theology in the 17th century, I think it might have been a little more controversial to be quite as certain as they were.
I see. Okay. So that's somewhat of an outlier then, that this group believe that. Is that what you're saying?
They seem to have a lot of Congregationalist writing in the 18th century in this period of the Revolution just seems much more confident in, going back to that sort of Calvinist theology of the elect and the damned, and this that you would never you could never actually be certain if you were going to heaven. Doesn't matter your works, that doesn't matter what you do. There's no certainty of that. And there's so much anxiety in 17th century New England writing about that, about their spiritual state.
Right.
And when we're looking at some of these 18th century writings, people did seem a bit more confident that they, especially through these relations of faith, in particular, these statements of faith that congregants would give to become members of a congregational church, they do seem a bit more confident that they will be saved.
Okay. And then this somehow carries over in some way to the confidence that God is on their side here. Okay. Interesting. I think we could have several podcast episodes together to talk through some of this stuff, but we only have 13 more minutes. So you focus on questions of liberty in this exhibition. What did liberty mean to Congregationalists during and after the war?
I think that's one of the major themes of the exhibition that we wanted to draw out, is this tension between the idea of liberty during the Revolutionary War and then the reality of it for many different groups in New England, for women, for indentured servants, for enslaved people, for free people of African descent, for indigenous nations, for loyalists, for other religious minorities like Quakers and Baptists in New England. That question of liberty, who does it apply to? And who's sort of coming up against it, against what the actual hard boundaries are on it. And so one example in the exhibition is we've got the admission record for Phyllis Wheatley Peters when she was admitted into the Old South Church in Boston. She was kidnapped from her home in West Africa at a young age and brought to Boston, enslaved by the Wheatleys. She also joined a church that was different from the church of her enslavers. She made this choice to join the Old South congregation. She sat in segregated seating. She pointed out some of the inconsistency, through her poetry, which really express themes of piety and liberty. Again, she's pointing out the inconsistency of both religious feeling and liberty in her poems, and how that's inconsistent with slavery. She writes a letter to Samson Occam in which she says that in every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. And so when war breaks out, she sends a poem to George Washington. She reminds him that he's fighting for freedom's cause. And so she's very clearly in her writing making that connection between liberty and freedom and the fate of enslaved people. That it's not just a political metaphor. It's not just rhetoric. It's very real. And she uses these religious themes so well in her work, writing thing. She says basically asks people to consider whether they will maintain God's favor. Will God continue to favor the people of New England and the patriot cause while so many among them remain enslaved? And so she's really hitting on these themes and this tension between this idea of liberty and reality in the colonies at that time.
Wow, what a story! So she wrote George Washington. Kyle, anything you want to add?
I think the real legacy of the revolution for Congregationalists is, around that, around those questions of the unfinished revolution and what liberty means. So I have found myself, when giving tours of this exhibit, being knocked back 20 years to when I was in graduate school. And the rage among us in my program was to kind of argue, was the revolution radical in what it accomplished and in its wellsprings, that a group of people would throw off the only political system that they and their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had ever known, and create this kind of democratic republic, which is a notoriously fragile political system? Or was it ultimately conservative in that the rhetoric didn't match the reality of what they delivered? And what we try to do in the exhibit is to give some examples that allow people to think in their own ways, to ask that question: is it enough to call something radical because it planted seeds? Congregationalists like to talk a lot about firsts. They're the first major Protestant denomination to ordain a woman, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, in the 1850s. The first to ordain an African-American minister, Lemuel Haynes, back in the 1790s. In their current incarnation as the United Church of Christ, the first to ordain an openly gay man and an open lesbian woman. A lot of those firsts come in there. But the fact that those firsts happen 75, 100, 200 years after the revolution speak to the fact that, was there a moment, would it have been possible in the 1770s, 1780s to really embrace the radicalness of starting the world anew and to have abolished slavery so that we wouldn't have had the Civil War, right? To have given equal suffrage to white men as well as women. I mean, remember that white male suffrage doesn't really become a thing universally until the 1820s, 1830s. And maybe the most heartbreaking part, there are many heartbreaking parts. I don't mean to make it a competition, but the Mashpee, indigenous communities of Massachusetts, fought with the Patriots. And they often had a congregational minister who was a missionary amongst them. We have his diaries from the 1780s and 1790s. The state of Massachusetts reduces them under a system of guardianship in 1789. I mean, we're not even 5-6 years from the close of the war, and these patriots are already losing their civil rights. And this just accelerates a spiral of land dispossession. And so we have to think about these questions of, was this necessary? Did this have to happen? Is this the liberty that the Mashpee in particular thought they were fighting for? And it is bound. It's not, just a Congregationalist, it's not just because of Congregationalists that happened, but they were part and parcel of that process. So it's a way that I think that in thinking about what liberty means to Congregationalists, they have to, and they especially today, really try to own both the triumphalist story as well as the shortcomings.
Okay. You answered sort of the question we asked last. I'll state it in case Tricia has something to say, and Kyle, you can add, but we have 6 minutes. I know you have something to do in 6 minutes. Kyle and Tricia, as we conclude, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from Congregationalists and their sacred rebellion, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
I think one thing I'd add is that thinking about our present moment, there's a lot of commemoration going on. As we're thinking about this 250th anniversary, which next year will be for the Declaration of Independence, but in Massachusetts we're already there. We're at 1775. We're already at 250 from April 19th. So, as we're thinking about these events and commemorating this anniversary, I think reflecting on the legacy is also important. And what's interesting, I think, for many historians is the historiography and looking at the way the narrative of the revolution has changed over time. We saw Congregationalist ministers like Nathan Fisk, quite mentioned, trying to shape that narrative about the legacy, from before the war even ended. In this kind of triumphalist interpretation of the war and the victory for the colonies. But and so many congregations were pretty instrumental in shaping the way that the war is remembered today, and particularly in New England. But that triumphant view of the revolution is complicated by a lot of the items that we have in our exhibition, right? Because we just get sort of stories that show different perspectives. We've got these loyalist ministers, right? That's not the traditional narrative. And we can read what they were writing and the sermons they were preaching and the way that their communities were complaining about them. Or in the case of one minister, who was suspected of being loyalist, they shot out his windows, right? There was, a physical threat and intimidation because they suspected that he might support the British. So just encouraging all of us to think about what documents we haven't seen yet, and how the stories that we know today can just create such a more complex and interesting story of the origins of the United States. And it doesn't have to be, um, it doesn't have to be scary or intimidating, I don't think, to look at those stories and to try to grapple with them and understand, how complex the history of the United States really is.
I think I think the thing we see again and again is that people actually hunger for the complexity. They appreciate the recognition. We had a group visiting this morning from the University of Michigan, and there was naturally kind of brought up the topic of, well, this anniversary is happening, but is it happening? What do we see? Because we haven't, for those of us who were alive in 1976 at the bicentennial, it was a very different vibe, right? It was a very different mood there. Certainly a nation that was polarized at that time, but we were sort of able to come together around this anniversary, the 200th anniversary. But that's also because there was a lot of federal coordination of it, right? There was a lot of, every state had a contribution to make. We live in a much more fragmented landscape in 2025, 2026. And so I think that there are ways that we're all looking for how to come back into community, right? That the sacred rebellion came out of these congregational communities. How do we come back into it? And I think, the principles of Congregationalism are really quite helpful for that. And, as Tricia says, these are communities that want to talk and discuss and debate and recognize they're not going to agree on everything, but will be able to, I think, in some ways come to consensus or come to agreement on some of the most important things that pull them together. One of the very last objects in the exhibit, and I think, Chris, you're going to be able to come up and see it sometime.
Yes.
And I'm really excited to show it to you, is the very first printing of a talk given by Frederick Douglass in 1852 at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. And in itself, it's beautifully preserved. It's this little pamphlet. It looks very fragile. It has written on the cover, from the collection of the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Franklin, Massachusetts, which is a little town here. We know that speech today as "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," right? This is Frederick Douglass's, in some ways, one of his most important reminders of the failures of the legacies of the American Revolution. And I think having that piece there as you leave, as you think about your place in community, and I guess I just love that so many communities, especially here in New England, will regularly have a day each year where they read that sermon, right? And they come together as a community to talk about that. So a long and slightly rambling way, I think, of thinking about that. Without this sacred rebellion, would we be having these conversations?
Okay, thank you. You both have the last word. We have been listening to Dr. Kyle Roberts and Dr. Tricia Pione of the Congregational Library and Archives in Boston, Massachusetts. I want to extend my sincere gratitude to you both for giving your time to help us understand 1770s Congregationalists and their role and roles in the American independence movement. Each of us listening is now better equipped to perfect and perpetuate the American experiment in self-government. I hope that you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.